There are moments in a person's life when the whole world seems to narrow down to a single point. A cracked ceiling above a mattress on the floor, the hum of a refrigerator running on borrowed time, the sound of a child soft breathing in the next room that somehow manages to be both the most beautiful and the most terrifying sound imaginable. Because that breathing means another day of finding a way. Another sunrise, demanding answers from a woman who has already sold everything she had left to sell. Rosa Delgado knew that particular kind of silence well. She had lived inside it for 3 years, and it had shaped her the way rivers shape stone. Slowly, without mercy, and without any interest in what the stone used to look like before the water arrived. She was 36 years old and looked 44. Not from vanity's calculations, but from the particular mathematics of hardship, the kind that carves lines around the eyes and hollows out the cheeks and turns hair dull before its time. She had been beautiful once, in the way that people are beautiful when they don't yet know how much life intends to take from them. High cheekbones from her mother's side, dark eyes from her father's, and a smile that her late husband had once told her could redirect traffic. She had laughed at that. She could barely remember laughing now. The apartment she shared with her daughter, Marisol, occupied the top floor of a building that used to be something, and now was not. 3 rooms, a kitchen where the faucet dripped no matter how many times the landlord promised to fix it. A living room where 2 mismatched chairs faced a television that only received 4 channels clearly. A bedroom that Marisol slept in, while Rosa unfolded a cot each night in the corner of the living room and tried to convince her body that this was sufficient rest. She kept the cot folded during the day. She did not want her daughter to see it as a permanent fixture. Permanence, she had decided, was a dangerous thing to accept when it came to suffering. Marisol was 8 years old and possessed the particular brand of optimism that children carry before the world teaches them otherwise. She still believed her mother could fix anything. She still reached for Rosa's hand in grocery stores and said, without any awareness of the cruelty of the question, "Can we get the strawberries today, Mama?" And Rosa would look at the price and feel the exact weight of the coins in her wallet without opening it and say, "Not today, my love. Next time." And Marisol would nod and trust her, completely and without reservation. And that trust was somehow heavier than all the bills stacked on the kitchen counter combined. Rosa worked 2 jobs. The first was at a dry cleaning business 3 blocks from their apartment, where she pressed shirts for people whose names she would never know and whose lives she could only imagine from the fabric of what they wore. Silk blouses, wool suits, the occasional wedding dress brought in for preservation, sealed in layers of hope and acid-free tissue. She started at 6 in the morning and worked until 2 in the afternoon, 5 days a week, and earned just enough to keep the lights on if nothing unexpected happened. The second job was evenings, 4 nights a week, a waitressing at a diner that smelled permanently of bacon grease and burnt coffee, and where the tips on a good night amounted to what a person with different circumstances would spend on a single meal somewhere nicer. On the 2 nights she did not waitress, she sat at the kitchen table after Marisol slept and studied for a bookkeeping certificate she was trying to earn online, 1 module at a time, on a laptop so old that it took 3 minutes to open a browser, and sometimes simply gave up halfway through loading a page, as though it too had reached its limit. She had no savings. She had no family nearby who could help in any meaningful way. Her mother had passed 4 years ago, which was the same year Rosa's husband, Diego, decided that the life they had built together was not the life he wanted, and he left for another city and another story in which Rosa and Marisol were not characters. He sent money sporadically, less than he was supposed to, and each time the deposit arrived, it was accompanied by no message, no explanation, only numbers in a bank account that never reflected the full amount a judge had ordered. Rosa had spoken to a lawyer once about pursuing the arrears. The lawyer had told her it would cost more to pursue than she was likely to recover in any reasonable time frame. She had thanked him and left, and sat in her car in the parking lot for 11 minutes before she trusted herself to drive. The city was indifferent to her. It went on around her, the way cities always do, loud and luminous, and absolutely unaware of any single person inside it. She had sometimes thought, while walking home from the diner at 10:30 at night, that she could disappear from this street and the concrete would not notice. Only Marisol would notice. Only Marisol's voice calling Mama from the bedroom on a Saturday morning when the cartoons came on. That was the rope she held. That was the thing that kept her walking forward on nights when the cold pressed through her coat and the soles of her shoes were worn so thin she could feel every crack in the sidewalk. It was on a Thursday evening in October, standing over a double sink full of someone else's dress shirts, that Rosa received the phone call that would change everything, though she did not know that yet. And she did not know anything that evening, except that her feet hurt, and that Marisol had mentioned a school field trip that required a permission slip and a $15 fee that Rosa had been quietly calculating how to produce for 4 days. When her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, she pulled it out with damp hands and looked at the screen. A number she did not recognize. An area code from a city 300 miles north. She almost declined it. She had learned to be cautious about calls from numbers she did not recognize. They were usually automated voices telling her about extended warranties or past due accounts. But something made her answer. A small, unexplainable instinct. She pressed the phone to her ear and said hello, and on the other end was a woman named Patricia Fuentes, who introduced herself as an attorney and asked, and in a careful, formal voice, whether she was speaking with Rosa Elena Delgado, niece of the late Aurelio Marcos Delgado. Rosa's breath caught. She said yes. Patricia Fuentes then told her, in the composed and practiced tone of someone who delivered news like this regularly, that her uncle Aurelio had passed away 6 weeks ago at the age of 79, and that Rosa had been named as the sole beneficiary of his estate. Rosa pressed her back against the sink. Around her, the dry cleaning machines continued their mechanical rhythms, indifferent. She had not spoken to her uncle Aurelio in 11 years. He was her father's older brother, a man she remembered from childhood as a figure of quiet eccentricity. Thin and tall, with white hair that he kept combed precisely and dark eyes that moved carefully, as though they were always reading something that wasn't there. He had never married. He had never, to Rosa's knowledge, held a conventional job. He lived alone in a house he had inherited from their grandfather in the northern part of the state, a house that Rosa had visited only twice as a child and remembered as a place of dim rooms, heavy curtains, and the particular silence of a man who kept his interior world intensely private. They had been close once. When Rosa was a girl, Aurelio had been the one family member who spoke to her as though she were capable of understanding serious things. He had given her books. He had asked her questions about what she thought, not what she felt, and he had listened to her answers with the full weight of his attention. She had loved him for that. But the years had carried them in different directions, and the last time she had tried to call, the number was disconnected, and she had told herself she would track down his new contact information soon, and soon had become 11 years. The attorney told her the estate consisted of the house on Calle Miramar, its contents, and a small parcel of land adjacent to the property. She told Rosa there was no liquid money in the estate. The property itself had been appraised, and the value was modest. The house needed significant repairs. There was a lien on it from unpaid property taxes going back 4 years. The total cost of clearing the lien, combined with the legal fees to transfer the title, would amount to approximately $9,000. If Rosa did not wish to pay this sum and claim the property, and the estate would pass to the county, and the house would be auctioned. Patricia Fuentes' tone made clear, in the way of professionals who have learned not to show personal involvement, that this was simply information, and that the choice was Rosa's. Rosa stood in the laundry steam and thought about $9,000. She thought about it the way you think about the distance between where you are standing and the moon. Present in theory, unreachable in practice. She thanked the attorney and said she would be in touch, and ended the call and put the phone back in her apron pocket and finished the shift without telling anyone what had just happened. On the walk home, she went over the numbers 3 times in her head and arrived at the same answer each time. She did not have $9,000. She did not have a fraction of $9,000. What she had was the rent for November, due in 18 days, and a refrigerator that was making a new sound she did not like, and a daughter who needed strawberries, and a field trip fee, and shoes that fit, because the current pair were already a full size too small. She told herself to forget about it. She told herself it was not a real opportunity so much as an announcement of something she could not reach, the way the evening news sometimes reported on lottery winners, informatively, but without any actual relevance to her life. She went home and made dinner, and helped Marisol with her reading homework, and tucked her in, and unfolded her cot, and stared at the ceiling, and thought about her Uncle Aurelio, who had given her a copy of a novel when she was 10 years old, and written on the inside cover, in his neat, deliberate handwriting, for Rosa, who I believe will understand this someday. She called Patricia Fuentes back the next morning. She told her she wanted the property. She asked whether there was any way to structure the payment. The attorney said the lien holder might accept a payment plan in exchange for a modest interest fee, and that the legal costs could be deferred if Rosa signed a promissory note against the property itself. It would take approximately 1 month to arrange. Rosa said she understood. She said yes. She did not know precisely how she would manage it. She only knew that she could not watch the only thing her uncle had ever given her disappear into a county auction without at least trying. What followed was the most difficult 4 weeks of her recent life, which was saying something. She picked up 2 additional waitressing shifts. She sold her wedding ring, which Diego had not asked for when he left, and which she had kept in a drawer for reasons she had never examined too closely. She borrowed $400 from a co-worker named Janet, a woman 20 years her senior who had a daughter of her own and who pressed the cash into Rosa's hand without ceremony, saying only, "You can pay me back whenever." She deposited everything into a single account she had opened specifically for this purpose, and watched the number grow with the slowness of something climbing a very steep hill. When the promissory note was signed, and the lien was cleared, and the title transferred into Rosa Elena Delgado's name, she sat in the attorney's office and felt nothing exactly. Not joy, not relief. Something quieter than both. The feeling of having said yes to something enormous, without yet understanding what that something was. She drove north to the house on Calle Miramar on a Saturday morning, leaving Marisol with Janet, and arrived just after noon. The house sat at the end of a short gravel drive behind a stand of old eucalyptus trees, whose bark peeled in long, pale strips, as though the trees were shedding old skins. The house itself was a 2-story structure built in the style of the early 20th century, with a pitched roof and a narrow porch running the length of the front, and windows framed by wooden shutters that had warped years ago and now hung at slight diagonal angles, like exhausted sentinels who had given up on standing straight, but had not yet given up on standing. The paint was the pale green of something that had once been bolder, bleached by decades of sun into a ghost of its original intention. Rosa parked the car and sat in it for a moment, looking at the house through the windshield. She had expected to feel something definitive, grief for her uncle perhaps, or excitement at the prospect of ownership. But what she felt was more complicated and less nameable. The house looked tired. It looked like a place that had been waiting for something without knowing what that something was. She recognized that feeling. She got out of the car. The front door key was on a ring the attorney had given her, along with a handwritten inventory that Patricia Fuentes had said was prepared by a local property assessor who had done a brief walkthrough 3 weeks prior. Rosa read through it as she stood on the porch. The inventory listed furniture, appliances, and other household items room by room. In the living room, 1 sofa, 2 armchairs, 1 coffee table, 1 side table, 1 floor lamp, 1 set of shelving units, assorted books. In the kitchen, 1 table, 4 chairs, 1 refrigerator, 1 stove, assorted small appliances in varying condition. In the master bedroom, 1 bed frame, 1 mattress, 1 dresser, 1 wardrobe. The word wardrobe caught her eye for a moment before she moved on. It appeared in the inventory as simply that, 1 wardrobe, wooden, large, assigned a value of approximately $0 due to age and condition. She had noted it and moved past it the way you note an item in a list that holds no particular interest. She had been focused on the house's structural condition, on whether the roof was sound, on whether there was mold, on the baseline questions of whether this property could be made livable, because the idea forming quietly in the back of her mind, the idea she had not yet allowed herself to say out loud, was that if she could make the house livable, she and Marisol could leave the apartment and live here, and the rent money she would no longer be paying would become something she could save. She unlocked the door and pushed it open. The interior smelled of old wood and something faintly herbal, as though someone had kept dried lavender somewhere, and its residue had become part of the air itself. The light inside was dim, filtered through the warped shutters and layers of dust on the windows. Shapes emerged gradually as her eyes adjusted. She stood in the entry hall and simply breathed for a moment, letting the house speak its first words to her in the only language a long-closed house knows, the language of silence and accumulated time. She moved through the rooms slowly, the property assessor's inventory in her hand, checking each item off mentally, taking stock not of value, but of condition. The sofa in the living room was salvageable if cleaned. The armchairs were beyond cleaning. The shelving units held hundreds of books, arranged by her uncle with visible care, their spines dusty, but their order deliberate. She ran a finger along the edge of one shelf and looked at the dark residue on her fingertip, and thought of all the Saturdays her uncle must have spent in this room, reading, thinking, existing inside his own private world. She felt the absence of him then, the first real wave of it, a man she should have tried harder to know. The kitchen was in better shape than she had expected. The refrigerator would need replacing, but the stove worked when she turned the knob. The table was solid. The floor tiles were old but uncracked. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the small yard, which was mostly weeds, but had the bones of something that had once been a garden. She could see the shapes of old stone borders where flower beds had been. She thought of Marisol, who loved anything that grew, and who had once spent an entire afternoon watching a spider build a web between 2 chairs on their apartment fire escape, narrating the process in a whispered commentary, as though not to disturb the work. Marisol would love a garden. She went upstairs. The staircase was narrow, and the wood on the upper steps was soft in 2 places, a thing she noted carefully and stepped around. The master bedroom was at the end of the hall. Its door was closed, and it opened with more resistance than the others, as though it had been shut for longer. Inside, the curtains were drawn, and the air was heavier, more still. The bed frame was iron, old and dark, with no mattress on it. The assessor had noted that the mattress had been removed and disposed of at some point, likely due to condition. The dresser stood against one wall, its mirror clouded with age. And against the opposite wall, Filling nearly the entire span from the corner to the window, stood the wardrobe. Rosa looked at it the way she had looked at the house from the car, with a kind of quiet inventory, taking stock before forming conclusions. It was large, considerably larger than she had imagined from the single word in the inventory. It stood perhaps 7 feet tall and easily 5 feet wide, built from a dark wood she could not immediately identify, though it had the deep grain and weight-suggesting presence of something old and serious. The carving on the upper panels was elaborate, not ostentatious, but deliberate, the kind of decorative work that required both skill and patience, 2 things that were apparently not in short supply when this piece was made. The hinges were brass, tarnished now to a brown-green color, and the door handles were brass as well, cast in a shape she could not quite categorize. Not quite a flower, not quite a knot. Something between. She crossed the room and opened the left door first. It moved with a faint groan, the hinge stiff but functional. Inside, her uncle's clothes still hung. She had expected this, and it did not unsettle her so much as it saddened her. Dark trousers, white shirts, a single dark suit jacket, a few items that were older and more formal, wrapped in dry cleaning bags that had yellowed. She gently moved one sleeve, and the fabric beneath was good, the kind of quality that did not age poorly. She stood for a moment, looking at these remnants of a man's daily life, the choices he made every morning about what to put on his body, now frozen in their hangers, waiting for a morning that would not come. She opened the right door. More clothes on this side, but fewer, and beneath the hanging items was a set of 3 deep drawers. She opened them one by one. The first held folded sweaters, each one placed with the same careful deliberateness she was beginning to recognize as her uncle's signature. The second held scarves and gloves and a few cloth handkerchiefs, monogrammed with the letter A. The third drawer was nearly empty, a leather belt, coiled, and underneath it a small envelope, sealed, with her name written on the front. Rosa's hand stilled. She picked up the envelope carefully and turned it over. Her name, in her uncle's handwriting. That careful, deliberate script she remembered from the inscription in the novel he had given her when she was 10. Rosa. Not Rosa Elena. Not Ms. Delgado. Just Rosa. As if he had known exactly who would be standing in this room on exactly this day, opening exactly this drawer. She held the envelope without opening it for a long moment, breathing in the cedar and lavender smell of the wardrobe's interior. Then she slid her finger beneath the seal. The letter inside was 2 pages long, written on paper that felt heavier than ordinary paper, the kind that resists time as though it has something important to say. She unfolded it and began to read. The first paragraph was an apology. Her uncle wrote that he had meant to reach her sooner, that the years had gotten away from him, in the way years do when a person becomes too absorbed in a singular project to look up often enough. He wrote that he had thought of her many times and hoped she was well, and that life had been fair to her, though he suspected it had not always been, because life rarely was fair to people who deserved it most. He wrote that he had a reason for leaving her the house, and not simply the house. He asked her to be patient with the process of discovering that reason. He asked her to look carefully. Rosa stopped at that sentence. She read it again. He asked her to look carefully. She looked up from the letter and looked at the wardrobe in front of her. Then she looked back at the letter. The second paragraph was more specific. He wrote that the wardrobe had been in the family longer than the house. It had come from their grandfather's side, brought from another country decades before Rosa was born, and it held within it something that he had known about for most of his adult life, but had chosen to keep protected in the way that certain things require protection. Not from greed, but from the understanding that some truths surface best when the right person is ready to receive them. He wrote that he believed Rosa was that person. He had believed it since she was 10 years old, and had read the book he gave her, and come to him a week later with 3 questions no child her age should have known to ask. The third paragraph was brief. He wrote, "The back panel isn't what it appears to be. Look at the joinery along the edges. Look at the way the wood was fitted together. When you find the seam, you will understand. Do not force it. This is not something to be forced." Rosa lowered the letter and stood very still in the dim bedroom. The curtains moved slightly, though she had not opened a window. Perhaps the old house had its own breath. She turned back to the wardrobe and looked at it differently than she had before. She reached in and pushed the hanging clothes gently to each side, clearing a view of the back panel. It appeared ordinary at first, a flat surface of the same dark wood as the rest of the piece, the grain running vertically in even, parallel lines. Nothing obviously unusual, nothing that announced itself. But then she stepped closer. She brought her face to within a foot of the wood and looked at the edges, the right edge where the back panel met the side wall of the wardrobe's interior. She had studied enough old furniture at the dry cleaners, watching wealthy customers bring in garments that lived alongside fine antiques, and to know what ordinary furniture joinery looked like. This was not it. The seam along the right edge was flush to the point of near invisibility, but it was there, a perfect, deliberate line. And unlike the other joinery in the wardrobe, which was fixed and final, this seam had a quality she could only describe as intentional breathing room. Not a flaw, not settling. Something built that way on purpose. She moved to the left edge. The same. A seam so precise it asked to be missed. She ran her fingertip along it from top to bottom, the way you run a finger along a sealed letter before deciding to open it, knowing that what is inside will change things, not knowing yet exactly how. The wood was cool under her touch, steady, patient. It had been waiting here, she realized, not for 11 years. Not even for the length of her uncle's long, private life. This piece of furniture had been waiting for longer than any single life could span. She did not force it, as he had asked. She stood back and looked at the whole of the wardrobe, at the carved upper panels, the tarnished brass handles, the doors hanging in their careful alignment. She looked at the proportions. The wardrobe was wide, yes, but not as wide on the inside as it was on the outside. She had not noticed this before, because she had not been looking for it. But standing back and comparing the exterior dimensions to the interior space, there was a discrepancy. Not dramatic, not cartoonish, just the kind of quiet, deliberate gap between what something appears to be and what it actually is. The kind of gap that a person only sees when they know to look. Her heart was moving differently now, not racing, something more precise than racing, a steadiness with an edge to it, the physical expression of standing at the boundary between before and after. She thought of her uncle, who had spent decades in this house with this wardrobe against this wall, who had known what she was only beginning to suspect, who had chosen her to receive it. She thought of herself, 48 hours ago, pressing shirts in a cloud of steam, calculating how many additional shifts she would need to cover Marisol's field trip fee. She thought of the letter folded in her hand, still warm from her palm, and the careful, deliberate handwriting, and the phrase he had chosen with such precision. Do not force it. This is not something to be forced. She folded the letter and put it in the pocket of her jacket. She took one more long, slow look at the back panel. Then she turned and walked out of the bedroom, down the narrow stairs, through the living room with its shelves of books, and out through the front door into the afternoon light. She stood on the porch and breathed the eucalyptus air and felt the sun on her face. The gravel drive curved away beneath the trees. The house stood behind her, holding itself together, holding its secret together, patient as it had always been. She needed to understand what she was looking at before she took another step. She needed someone who knew old furniture, who knew craftsmanship of this age and type, who could look at the joinery and the proportions and tell her whether what she suspected was possible or whether she was grieving her uncle in an unusual way and constructing significance out of ordinary wood. She needed an expert. She thought of a name. She pulled out her phone. The drive back to the city that evening felt different from the drive up. She had gone north with $9,000 of borrowed and scraped-together money and a set of keys to a house she had no idea what to do with. She returned with a letter in her pocket and a question in her mind that she could not yet frame precisely enough to speak aloud. The highway unspooled ahead of her in the dark, and the lights of other cars passed like punctuation in a language she was only beginning to learn. She thought about her uncle, sitting alone in that bedroom for all those years, looking at that wardrobe. She thought about the word he had chosen: protected. She had chosen to keep it protected, as if what lay inside was alive in some sense that required safeguarding, as if the wrong moment or the wrong hands would have broken something essential. She thought about what it means to choose a person to trust with something enormous, how that choice is never careless, how her uncle, in all his years of careful and deliberate living, had watched her from a distance and thought about this decision and written her name on an envelope and placed it in a drawer, in a wardrobe, in a room at the end of a hall, in a house at the end of a gravel drive beneath eucalyptus trees, and waited. She reached the city at 9:30. She picked up Marisol from Janet's apartment. Her daughter was already in her pajamas and smelled of Janet's lavender soap and was half asleep. And Rosa carried her to the car and buckled her in gently and drove the familiar streets home and carried her up the stairs and put her in bed without fully waking her. She stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment and looked at her daughter in the yellow light from the hall, small and trusting and complete, and felt something she could not name exactly. Then she went to the kitchen table and sat down and unfolded her uncle's letter one more time. And in the quiet of the apartment, with the faucet dripping its faithful rhythm and Marisol breathing softly in the next room, she read it again from the beginning. And this time, she read it the way her uncle had once asked her to read the novel he gave her, with patience, and with the understanding that some things reveal themselves only when you have earned the ability to see them. The seam was there. She was certain of it. And what lay behind it had been waiting long enough. The next morning she called a man named Daniel Escobedo, whose name she had found 3 years ago in a pamphlet at the city library. During an afternoon she had brought Marisol to Story Hour. The pamphlet had been advertising an exhibition of antique furniture restoration, and Daniel's name had appeared as the lead conservator and resident expert in Spanish, colonial, and European hardwood cabinetry, dating from the 17th through 19th centuries. She had kept the pamphlet the way she kept all paper that seemed potentially useful, in a manila folder tucked inside the largest drawer of the kitchen, organized by category in a system so precise it would have surprised anyone who looked at the apartment's exterior order and assumed chaos lived inside. She found the pamphlet quickly. She dialed the number. Daniel Escobedo answered on the third ring. He had a voice that matched his occupation. Careful, deliberate, accustomed to patience. She explained that she had recently inherited a piece of antique furniture, a large wardrobe, and that she believed there were some unusual features in its construction that she could not evaluate on her own. He asked her a few questions. What type of wood did it appear to be? She described the color and grain as best she could. Had she noted any maker's marks, any stamps or inlaid identifications on the exterior? She told him she had not looked yet. He asked about the dimensions, and when she gave him her best estimate of the height and width and depth, he went quiet for a moment, in a way that suggested he was converting those numbers into something meaningful. He agreed to make the drive north with her on Sunday. He named a fee for his time that was not small, and which Rosa calculated against the money she had earned in 3 shifts of waitressing the previous week, and accepted without hesitation, because some things you paid for not knowing what the return would be, on the understanding that the question itself was worth the cost. She thanked him and ended the call, and sat for a moment at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface, feeling the wood beneath her palms, thinking about different wood in a different room 300 miles away, fitted together with the kind of precision that was either extraordinary craftsmanship or something more. She did not tell anyone what she suspected. There was no one to tell, really. Janet would have listened with genuine kindness, but Rosa did not yet have the words for what she was thinking, because what she was thinking existed at the edge of something that might be nothing, and she had trained herself over the last 3 years to be very careful about the edge of something that might be nothing. That edge was where hope lived, and hope was expensive. She had learned not to go there without provisions. She told Marisol only that she had inherited a house from her uncle, and that they might be able to go and look at it soon. And Marisol had received this information with the particular enthusiasm of a child who understands intuitively that a house is better than what they currently have. And she had asked immediately if there was a yard. And Rosa had said yes, there was something like a yard. And Marisol had asked whether they could plant tomatoes, and Rosa had said she didn't see why not. And they had eaten dinner in a companionable quiet after that, each of them privately and separately inhabiting a vision of something better, which is perhaps the most human thing 2 people can do together over a shared meal. On Saturday, Rosa drove back to the house alone. She needed time there without the pressure of an expert's presence or the distraction of needing to explain what she was feeling. She needed to simply be in the rooms for a while and let the house speak to her in its patient, accumulated way. She brought cleaning supplies this time, and she worked her way through the downstairs rooms with a methodical steadiness, wiping surfaces and clearing cobwebs and opening windows to let the autumn air move through. She found, in the process of cleaning, 3 things that seemed to her relevant to the story of her uncle's life. The first was a certificate from a university library system acknowledging Rosa Delgado as a major donor in the acquisition of a private collection of historical documents. The second was a receipt, tucked inside a book on the living room shelf, from a conservationist in Geneva, dated 12 years ago, for the professional assessment of a piece of antique European furniture shipped to that address at considerable expense. The third was a handwritten note, found in the kitchen drawer beneath a stack of old utility bills, in her uncle's handwriting, that said only, "When the time comes, Rosa will know what to do." She has always known what to do. She stood in the kitchen holding that piece of paper for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the eucalyptus trees, and the gravel drive was gold in the afternoon light, and the house was quiet around her in the way of things that have been holding something carefully for a very long time, and are not yet ready to release it, but are close. She went upstairs. She stood before the wardrobe again. She did not open it this time. She simply looked at it from the doorway. In the slanted afternoon light coming through the warped shutters, the dark wood took on a depth she had not noticed before, the grain shifting from brown to something almost amber at the edges, as if the wood itself held a light source somewhere inside. The carved panels at the top cast small shadows. The brass handles glowed dully. The whole piece had the quality of something that had outlived everything around it, not through luck, but through intent, because it had been made to last by hands that understood what lasting required. Tomorrow, Daniel Escobedo would come. He would look at the joinery and tell her whether her uncle's letter meant what she thought it might mean. And then she would know whether she was standing at the beginning of something remarkable, or whether she was simply a woman in a difficult season of life, looking at an old wardrobe and wanting very badly for it to be more than wood. She turned off the bedroom light and walked down the hall and descended the stairs and locked the front door behind her. She drove home through the early dark with the radio off, listening to the sound of the engine and the road, thinking about her uncle's careful hands, writing her name on an envelope, and placing it in a drawer, and closing a door, and believing, with the particular certainty of a man who had spent his whole life being careful about what he believed, that she would find it. She thought about the seam she had traced with her fingertip, flush and deliberate and patient. A door that did not announce itself, a secret that had no interest in being found by the wrong person at the wrong time. Sunday was coming, and with it, the first real answer. Until Daniel Escobedo arrived at the house on Calle Miramar at 10 in the morning, driving a truck that was older than it appeared and more capable than it looked, the kind of vehicle that belonged to a man who spent his working life moving between places where objects from the past lived and needed tending. He was 61 years old, slight and deliberate in his movements, with the quality of stillness that comes to people who have spent decades working with fragile things and learned that stillness is a form of respect. He carried a soft leather case and a small flashlight, and wore a pair of thin cotton gloves tucked into the breast pocket of his canvas jacket. He shook Rosa's hand when she met him at the end of the gravel drive, and he looked at the house for a long moment before saying anything. The way people in his profession look at things, with the part of the eye that has been trained to see age and intention simultaneously. He said it was a good house. He said it with the tone of someone stating a fact rather than offering a comfort. She liked him for that. She took him upstairs without preamble. She had spent the drive north that morning, organizing her thoughts, deciding how much to tell him before he saw the piece, and how much to let him discover on his own. She had decided on less rather than more. She would show him the wardrobe and watch what his trained eyes found without the influence of her uncle's letter to guide him toward a predetermined conclusion. What an expert saw independently would be more valuable than what he found looking for something specific. She opened the bedroom door and stepped back. Daniel Escobedo walked in, set his leather case on the floor beside the door, and stood very still in front of the wardrobe. He looked at it the way she imagined surgeons looked at a patient before the first incision, fully, quietly, taking in everything available before touching anything. After perhaps 2 full minutes of this observation, he said, without turning around, "Where did this come from originally?" She told him what she knew, that it had been in the family for generations, brought from another country. He nodded slowly. He asked which country. She said she did not know precisely. He nodded again. He pulled on his cotton gloves and moved to the exterior of the piece, running his hands along the carved upper panels with a lightness of touch that seemed almost reverent. He leaned close to the wood, bringing the flashlight out and directing its beam at a low angle across the surface of the carving, which caused the relief to sharpen dramatically, each carved line throwing its own small shadow. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This carving is consistent with Catalan workshop traditions of the 18th century, possibly earlier. There were workshops in the region producing furniture of this quality through approximately 1780, after which French influence began to change the vocabulary. This piece predates that influence." He touched one of the brass handles gently, turning it slightly in its mount without removing it. He said the hardware was consistent with the estimated period of the woodwork. He said both were consistent with each other. Rosa stood in the doorway and said nothing. She watched him move around the exterior of the piece with a systematic deliberateness, examining each surface, each joint, each element of the decorative work. She noticed that his pace slowed when he reached the left side panel. He spent time there that he had not spent on the right side. He brought the flashlight very close to the wood and tilted it at several angles. He pressed his fingertips against the panel with a gentleness that was almost hesitant. Then he moved to the right side panel and did the same thing, and the same slowing occurred, and the same careful quality of attention. He opened the left door. He stood looking at the hanging clothes and the interior left wall for a long moment before reaching in to push the clothes aside, gently, as though the garments themselves warranted respect. He looked at the back panel. He looked at the right interior wall. He reached into his leather case for a thin measuring tape and ran it along the interior width of the wardrobe's left side, from the back panel to the inner face of the left exterior wall. He noted the number. Then he closed the left door, walked to the exterior left side of the wardrobe, and measured the thickness of that wall at its midpoint. He noted the second number. He was quiet for a moment, in which Rosa could see him calculating. He opened the right door and repeated the process. Interior measurement, external wall thickness, 2 numbers, another calculation. He straightened up and removed his gloves carefully, folding them in his palm. The exterior depth of this piece, he said, looking at the wardrobe rather than at her, is 48 inches. The interior depth, to accounting for the back panel thickness, should be approximately 44 inches. It is 37. He paused. The lateral wall thickness on the left side at the exterior is 5 inches. The corresponding interior wall is the same 5 inches. He paused again. The lateral wall thickness on the right side at the exterior is also 5 inches. The interior wall registers approximately 2.5. He turned to look at her then. His expression was not dramatic. It was the expression of a man confirming something he has suspected for a while and is now deciding how to communicate. There is a void, he said, in the right wall and in the back panel. The measurements suggest a concealed compartment of substantial dimension. He held her gaze. This is not incidental. This is designed. The joinery at the seam points on the interior back panel is constructed with a releasing mechanism rather than a fixed joint. Something along the right interior wall acts as the activation point. He looked back at the wardrobe. I have seen this type of construction exactly twice in my career. Once in a documented piece at the Barcelona Museum of Decorative Arts, and once in a private collection in Seville. Both were attributed to craftsmen who worked during the latter half of the 18th century for clients who had specific reasons to keep certain things inaccessible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. Rosa's voice was very steady when she spoke. She had been practicing steadiness for 3 years, and she was good at it. Can it be opened? Daniel Escobedo put his gloves back on. He said yes. He said it carefully, as though the word itself required preparation. He said he believed the mechanism would be in the interior right wall, likely integrated into one of the carved elements or the framework of the drawer system. He said these mechanisms were designed to be operated by a specific motion rather than a key in the conventional sense, because keys could be found and copied, and the whole point of this type of construction was that the knowledge of how to open it was itself the lock. He said he would need her permission to explore the mechanism, and that she should understand it was possible they would find nothing except a craftsman's error or an unusual design choice with no functional purpose. He looked at her. He said, "But I do not believe that is what we will find." She said, "Please open it." He worked slowly. She stood in the doorway and watched him move along the right interior wall of the wardrobe with systematic, feather-light fingertip pressure, touching each element of the carved framework one at a time, applying the most delicate compression or rotation to each point, and waiting to feel whether anything responded. He was not in a hurry. The patience he brought to this was the same patience he had brought to the initial observation, the same quality of attention that suggested whatever was happening inside him as he worked was happening at a different speed than what was visible on the outside. 15 minutes passed, then 20, Rosa had shifted from the doorway to the iron bed frame at some point, sitting on its edge without a mattress beneath her, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the back of Daniel Escobedo's head as he worked. The bedroom was very quiet. The eucalyptus outside moved in the wind, and the shutters let small crossings of light happen across the floor. Somewhere in the house, a pipe settled with a faint knock. Then Daniel Escobedo stopped. He had his fingers on a carved element near the top right corner of the interior drawer framework, a small boss in the wood, barely distinguishable from the decorative elements around it, which Rosa had assumed was simply part of the overall carving pattern. He pressed it once, lightly, with his index finger. Nothing happened. He pressed it again, and simultaneously applied a slight rotational pressure with his thumb on the interior wall surface approximately 6 inches below. And then something happened. It was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. There was a sound that was less than a sound, a release of pressure, almost like a soft exhale from inside the wood. And then the back panel of the wardrobe moved. Not swung open, not fell away. Moved. With the smooth, deliberate patience of something that has been waiting a long time to do this exact thing, and is doing it at the pace it was designed for, which was not the pace of urgency, but the pace of purpose. The panel shifted first an inch, then 2. The seam Rosa had traced with her fingertip 2 days ago, now becoming a visible gap, a dark line against the wood that widened as the panel continued its slow, measured travel. When it stopped, the panel had rotated inward and to the right on a pivot system that was invisible from outside, on creating an opening approximately 18 inches across that led into the space behind. Daniel Escobedo stepped back. He lowered his flashlight and turned to look at Rosa. His expression had changed. The professional composure was still there, but behind it was something she recognized as genuine astonishment. The expression of a man whose expertise had prepared him to suspect something, and whose lifetime of experience had still not fully prepared him for the reality of it. She stood up from the bed frame and crossed the room to stand beside him. They both looked into the opening together. The flashlight beam moved into the darkness behind the panel, and in what it illuminated first was the interior of a concealed chamber that extended well beyond the back panel's position and into what was evidently a much deeper space than the wardrobe's exterior dimensions had suggested. The discrepancy she had noted was only partially explained by the chamber behind the right wall. The deeper space, which ran behind the entire back panel, was built into the wall of the room itself, a purpose-built cavity that had been framed into the house's structure and finished with the same dark wood as the wardrobe's interior, making the wardrobe's back wall continuous with the concealed room's front wall, an architectural sleight of hand that was so complete that even someone who had ripped the wardrobe from its position and examined the wall behind it might have found only plaster and lath. Daniel Escobedo swept the flashlight around the interior of the chamber. It was approximately 3 feet deep, 6 feet wide, and nearly the full height of the wardrobe, which meant it was close to 7 feet tall. The walls were smooth, dark wood, and along those walls, on shelves that had been built in with the same precision as everything else in this construction, were objects. Rosa's first coherent thought was that they were boxes. Then, as her eyes adjusted and Daniel's flashlight moved steadily around the space, she understood that some of them were not boxes, but stacked and bound documents, tied with cord that had aged to a darkened straw color. Others were cases, fitted, protective cases, of a kind she associated with instruments or objects that require specific containment. Others were drawers, built into the shelving, while their fronts featureless, distinguishable only by a faint line where they opened. At the base of the chamber, centered and standing on what appeared to be a fitted wooden platform, was a large rectangular object wrapped in many layers of dark cloth and tied with the same cord as the document bundles, its shape suggesting a painting, though it could have been something else. Daniel Escobedo had not moved and had not spoken. His flashlight remained steady. He was breathing through his nose with the deliberate evenness of someone who has decided consciously to control his own response. Rosa said, "I need more light." He produced a second, larger flashlight from his leather case and handed it to her. She stepped forward into the wardrobe and through the opening into the chamber, and the air inside was different immediately. Not stale in the way of a room long closed, but climate-contained, in the way of a space that had been engineered to resist the natural processes of time. The temperature dropped perceptibly. The air was dry. These were not accidents. Someone had thought carefully about preservation. She brought the flashlight to the nearest shelf, where 3 fitted cases rested side by side. The cases were made of a material she could not immediately identify. Not leather, not wood, not fabric, but something between all 3. A composite that had retained its form and texture across what she was beginning to understand was a very long period of time. The cases had no obvious openings, no clasps, no hinges she could see. She did not touch them. She looked at the document bundles next. The cord holding them was frayed at its knots, but the documents themselves, wrapped in what appeared to be protective cloth beneath the cord, had been shielded from the air well enough that they appeared intact. She could not read the top surfaces without untying the bundles, and she did not do this. She moved to the drawers. There were 5 of them, built into the lower right section of the shelving. She pulled the first one open with 2 fingers on its bottom edge, drawing it slowly toward her. It moved on runners that had been fitted with such precision that there was no sound at all, no friction, no resistance beyond the initial engagement. Inside the first drawer, on a surface of dark velvet that had retained its nap in the climate-controlled air, lay 3 objects in fitted depressions. Coins. They were large, heavy-looking, and even in the flashlight beam, they emitted a particular quality of light that Rosa associated with exactly one thing. She had never in her life been close to significant quantities of gold, but she had seen photographs, and she had read about it, and the color of what she was looking at was the color that photographs tried to approximate and never quite achieved. She stood very still. She looked at the coins without touching them. Each was larger than any coin she had ever handled. Their surfaces, stamped with images she could not make out clearly at this angle in this light. But the rims were raised and precise in the way of deliberately minted objects, not cast, not improvised, but made with the full authority of a system that understood what lasting currency required. She drew the drawer slowly closed. She opened the second drawer. More velvet, more fitted depressions. These objects were rectangular, flat, uniform. She picked one up, using both hands with an instinctive care she could not have explained. It was cold. Heavier than it appeared to be. It filled her palm and required both hands to feel secure. She tilted it toward the flashlight. The surface was unmarked, except for a small stamp at one end, containing letters and numbers she could not read in this light. She turned it over. The opposite surface was smooth, unmarked, perfect. The color was unmistakable. She set it back carefully in its depression and sat with what she was looking at and breathed. Daniel Escobedo had entered the chamber behind her. He stood to her left, his own flashlight directed at the upper shelving, where he was examining the fitted cases. His professional composure had returned fully, which she recognized as a coping mechanism rather than an absence of response. He said very quietly, "The cases on the upper shelf are consistent with instrument cases used to protect items of value in transit or storage during the 17th through 19th centuries. The construction is European. The composite material on the exterior is a specialized compound that I have seen used in museum archival storage. Someone either had access to professional conservation supplies or had a professional conservationist assist in preparing this chamber. He was quiet for a moment. Your uncle, or someone before him, understood exactly what they were protecting and how. Rosa said, "The drawers contain gold." She said it the way you say something you have been thinking for 20 minutes and have finally decided is too large to keep inside your body unsaid. Not as a question, not as an exclamation, as a statement of fact, delivered to the air of a dim chamber, inside a wardrobe, inside a bedroom, inside a house she had owned for exactly 11 days. Daniel Escobedo turned his flashlight toward the drawers. He opened the second one himself, the one she had just closed, and looked at its contents. He lifted one of the rectangular bars in his gloved hand, turned it, read the stamp she could not read. He set it down. He moved to the third drawer and opened it. More coins, these ones different in size and design from the first drawer. He opened the fourth. Document sleeves, protective archival quality, while each containing what appeared to be a single sheet behind a transparent protective surface. He held his flashlight to one. The document inside was old. The ink had the sepia quality of age. He said, "This appears to be written in Catalan." He said it with the careful detachment of a man trying to keep the professional register dominant. He said, "The language is consistent with the period suggested by the wardrobe's construction." She opened the fifth drawer. It was shallower than the others, and in it, laid flat, was a single object, a small book. Not a modern book, but a handmade one, its cover of thick board, wrapped in leather that had darkened to near black, its pages visible at the edge as dense, yellowed sheets, with handwriting visible on each one. On the cover, no title. On the inside front cover, which she opened with 2 fingers, on a name written in ink that had oxidized to brown, in a hand that was careful and deliberate, and nothing like her uncle's hand, but which produced in her exactly the same sensation that her uncle's handwriting had produced 2 days ago in the envelope. The name was not one she recognized, but below it, in a different hand and different ink, newer, though still old, were the words, "This is the record. Keep it whole." Rosa closed the book and replaced it in its drawer. She stood in the chamber for a moment longer, the flashlight in her hand sending its beam across the shelves, across the cases, across the wrapped object at the base that she had not yet approached. The wrapped object that was the size and shape of a painting. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked back at Daniel Escobedo, who was looking at her with the expression of someone waiting for her to indicate how to proceed. She said, "I need to have all of this evaluated, properly, by people who know what they're looking at." He said, "Yes." He said it with a weight that meant much more than the word itself. She said, "Can you help me find those people?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know who to call. I have known these colleagues for many years, and I trust them." He paused. "But I want to say something to you before we do that." She waited. He said, "What is in this room is not ordinary. I have spent 40 years working with antique objects of value, and I can tell you that what you have here is—" He stopped. He chose his next words with the same care he had used with the wardrobe's mechanisms. "What you have here is something that does not surface in the course of a normal career. I am telling you this not to overwhelm you. I am telling you this so that you understand from this moment forward that you must be careful. Not with the objects, with the information. The fewer people who know what is in this room, the safer you will be while the evaluation takes place." She understood him. She thanked him. She did not ask him to elaborate on what careful meant, because she had been living carefully for 3 years, and she understood the principle. They spent another hour in the chamber, with Daniel making methodical notes in a small notebook he produced from his leather case, documenting what was visible in each location without disturbing anything further. He photographed the contents systematically, using a small camera from his case rather than a phone, and he told her the photographs would stay on his camera until she decided how to proceed. He sealed the memory card and put it in an envelope and handed it to her, and she put it in her jacket pocket. They left the chamber, and Daniel engaged the release mechanism again, observing the position that caused the panel to begin its return journey. And together, they watched the opening narrow and close until the seam was invisible again, and the back panel was simply the back of a wardrobe, deep and dark and unremarkable. She pulled the clothes back across the hanging bar. She closed both doors. The wardrobe stood as it had stood when she walked into this room 6 days ago, old, ornate, and valued at approximately $0 by the property assessor, whose brief walkthrough had seen only the surface of things. On the drive back to the city that evening, she called Janet from the road, using the car's speaker, and asked whether Marisol was all right. Janet said she was fine. She was watching a movie. She had eaten 2 helpings of dinner and showed no signs of slowing down. Rosa said she would be back by 9. Janet said, "Take your time." There was a warmth in Janet's voice that Rosa had been relying on for 2 years and had never properly thanked her for. And sitting in the dark car on the highway, with the night spread around her, and the knowledge of what she had seen in that chamber pressing against the inside of her chest, and she felt the inadequacy of all the thanks she had ever given people who had held her up during the worst stretch of her life. She thought, "I will find a way to make this right." She thought, "I will find a way to be the person who gives rather than receives." She thought, "Not yet, but soon." Daniel Escobedo called 3 days later. He had been in contact with 2 colleagues, a specialist in pre-Columbian and colonial European artifacts at a university museum, and a senior valuation consultant for a firm that handled significant estate appraisals at the intersection of art, historical artifacts, and precious metals. Both had agreed to travel to the house on Calle Miramar for a preliminary evaluation. Both had been told, in the careful terms that Daniel used when professional discretion was required, that the situation was sensitive and that confidentiality was not a preference, but a necessity. Both had confirmed they understood. The evaluation was scheduled for a Saturday 9 days out. Rosa spent those 9 days in a state of controlled suspension, the way she had spent the weeks before she received her bookkeeping exam results, or the days before a job interview that she needed to go well. She continued her shifts at the dry cleaners. She waited tables 4 nights that week and received the best tips she had earned in months from a party of 8, celebrating a birthday, and a couple in the corner who held hands across the table and tipped 30% on a modestly priced dinner, as though the ability to leave a generous tip was something they wanted to practice. She studied for her bookkeeping module on Tuesday and Thursday nights, sitting at the kitchen table with the laptop's fan running quietly and Marisol's breathing audible through the bedroom wall. She told no one. She thought about the wardrobe constantly. She thought about the coins in their velvet depressions, and the gold bars cold and heavy in her palm, and the small book with the name she did not recognize written on its inside cover. She thought about the painting-shaped object wrapped in dark cloth at the base of the chamber, which she and Daniel had not unwrapped. She thought about her uncle in that house for all those years, living alone with this knowledge, protecting it, deciding decade by decade to keep the chamber sealed and the wardrobe in place, and the secret intact until he found the right moment and the right person. She thought about what it must have cost him to carry that alone. She drove north the night before the evaluation and slept in the house for the first time, on an air mattress she had brought from the city, in the room at the end of the hall with the wardrobe against the wall. She did not sleep well. The house made its nighttime sounds around her, and the wardrobe was a large, still presence in the dark, and she lay on the air mattress and looked at the ceiling and breathed the cedar and lavender air, and thought about the distance between where she had been 3 weeks ago and where she was now. The distance was not yet measurable in practical terms. Nothing had changed in practical terms. She still owed Janet $400. Her shoes still had thin soles. Marisol still could not have strawberries whenever she asked. But the nature of the horizon had shifted, in the way that horizons shift, not when you arrive at the destination, but when you first understand that the destination is real. She was awake before the evaluators arrived. She had made coffee in the kitchen with a bag of grounds she had brought, and a small percolator she found in a cabinet. The morning was clear and cold, and the eucalyptus trees stood very still in the early light, their long leaves catching the low sun at angles that made them look silver. She stood on the porch with the coffee and looked at the gravel drive and the trees and the land beyond, and tried to prepare herself for what the day was going to tell her. The two experts arrived together, which surprised her. They had apparently driven from the same city and had met at a rest stop en route. So the university museum specialist was a woman named Dr. Adriana Sousa, compact and precise in her movements, with reading glasses pushed up on top of her head and a carrying case of examination tools that she handled with the authority of long familiarity. The valuation consultant was a man named Marcus Freed, tall and deliberate, who wore a plain dark jacket and carried nothing but a leather notebook and a phone with a camera that he kept in his breast pocket. Daniel Escobedo arrived 10 minutes after them. The four of them stood briefly in the kitchen drinking coffee and speaking in the careful, measured way of people who are all skilled at not saying more than is necessary before they have seen what they have come to see. Then Rosa took them upstairs. Dr. Adriana Sousa looked at the wardrobe with the same quality of still and total attention that Daniel had brought to it 9 days ago, though her attention rested on different elements. She moved to the carving immediately, not touching, but looking, at close range and from distance, shifting angles with a practiced efficiency. She asked Rosa to hold a light at an oblique angle to the upper left panel, and she stood back and looked at what the shadows revealed of the carving's depth and layering. She said 3 words in a language Rosa did not speak, then said in English, "It is as described." She looked at Daniel. She said, "Your assessment of the period and workshop tradition is consistent with what I am seeing." Marcus Freed stood back from the wardrobe and said nothing. He was looking at the room, not the piece. Rosa watched him scan the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and the relative position of the wardrobe in relation to the room's dimensions. She understood that he was doing a different kind of calculation than the one Daniel had done with his measuring tape. He was calculating something about the whole system, the room, the piece, the placement, and whatever he was arriving at was visible in the quality of attention he was giving to the space rather than the object. She engaged the mechanism herself, under Daniel's guidance, and this time the back panel moved with a familiarity that was almost comfortable. The release and the slow pivot and the widening gap, and then the dark opening with its climate-different air. She stood back and let the experts enter the chamber. The next 2 hours were the most carefully silent 2 hours of Rosa's life. She stood near the doorway while Dr. Sousa and Marcus Freed moved through the chamber with systematic thoroughness, opening drawers, examining cases, handling objects in their gloved hands, with a care that was beautiful in its precision. Daniel stood to one side and watched, occasionally asking a quiet question or making a note in his book. Rosa did not ask questions. She watched. She saw Dr. Sousa open the fitted cases on the upper shelf and look at what was inside each one for a long time before carefully recording what she saw. She saw Marcus Freed handle the gold bars with a thoroughness that went well beyond the simple identification she had made by touch and sight. He weighed each one on a small scale he produced from his leather notebook's inner pocket, a digital scale, flat and precise, and recorded each weight in his notebook with the focus of someone who understands that numbers in situations like this are evidence of a kind that demands accuracy. She saw Dr. Sousa approach the wrapped object at the base of the chamber and stand before it for a moment without touching it, as though acknowledging it before disturbing its long rest. Then, with Marcus Freed holding a light and Daniel close beside her, she untied the cord and began to unwrap the dark cloth layers. Slowly, each layer folded back with deliberate care until the last layer fell away, and what was inside was visible. Rosa, from the doorway, could see only that it was a painting in a frame, a canvas painting in a heavy, dark frame. She could not see the image at this angle and in this light. She saw Dr. Sousa's reaction instead, which was a precise, controlled intake of breath followed by complete stillness. Then Dr. Sousa said something very quietly to Marcus Freed in the language Rosa did not speak, and Marcus Freed looked at the painting and said something back, also quietly. Then Dr. Sousa turned around and looked at Rosa in the doorway with an expression that Rosa would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately, settling eventually on something like the expression of a person who has just witnessed something they were not sure still existed in the world. Dr. Sousa said, "Come and see this." Rosa crossed the chamber. She stood before the painting. What she saw was a religious scene, figures in the formal European tradition, painted in the layered, luminous technique that she associated with the old masters she had seen in reproductions and books, though she had never stood in front of an original. The figures were arranged in a composition that had a quality of absolute deliberateness, every element placed in precise relationship to every other element, the light in the painting coming from a source within the image itself rather than from any external direction, in the way that only painters who understood light as a theological concept rather than a physical one could achieve. The colors beneath the centuries of protective varnish were still present in their original register. Deep blues, burgundies, the particular gold that was not gold pigment, but golden light. The white of fabric rendered with the kind of care that made you understand that the painter had a feeling about cloth that went beyond its function. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Dr. Sousa. "Doctor," Sousa said, "I cannot make a definitive attribution in this setting. That will require laboratory analysis and provenance research. But the technique, the panel preparation, the craquelure pattern of the varnish, the compositional conventions." She stopped. She said, "There is a painter whose work matches what I am looking at in every visible characteristic, and that painter has not had a documented missing work resurface in more than 40 years. She looked at Rosa steadily. If the attribution holds, and I want to be careful about that word, if because attribution requires time and rigorous process, the value of this painting alone would be—" She paused again. "It would be exceptional." She said the word exceptional with a precision that told Rosa it was doing the work of a much larger word that she was choosing not to say yet. When Marcus Freed had been recording in his notebook, he looked up. He said, "Can we discuss numbers?" They went downstairs to the kitchen. The four of them sat around the table that had been her uncle's table, with the coffee cooling in the percolator and the autumn light coming through the window and the yard visible beyond the glass with its old stone garden borders. Marcus Freed placed his notebook flat on the table and turned it so Rosa could see what he had written. The columns were neat. The categories were labeled. She looked at the numbers. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked up. Her face was still. She had trained her face to be still over 3 years of practice at staying composed under pressure. But she could feel, underneath that composure, something enormous moving, on something that had been still for 3 years beginning to move again, like a tide returning to a shoreline that had almost forgotten what it felt like to be reached. Marcus Freed said, "This is a preliminary figure. These are estimates based on current market references for comparable items, with conservative adjustments for condition and provenance uncertainty. The painting is not included because it cannot be estimated without attribution analysis." He tapped the notebook. "What is included is the gold content, both coins and bars, which by weight alone represent a significant sum, and the documentary materials, which if they contain what Dr. Sousa believes they may contain in terms of provenance records, could substantially affect the value of the other items." He said the number again. $256 million. So he said, conservatively, and without the painting. The kitchen was very quiet. The faucet that Rosa had told herself she would eventually fix dripped its faithful rhythm. The light moved slightly through the yard as a cloud passed over the sun and then departed. Rosa looked at the table surface, the old wood grain of it, and thought about her uncle sitting at this table in the mornings with his coffee, knowing what was upstairs, living beside this knowledge for decades, choosing to hold it until the right time. She thought about the phrase he had written in his note. "When the time comes, Rosa will know what to do." She has always known what to do. She looked up at the 3 people sitting across from her and said, "What do I do next? What do I do next?" The question hung over the kitchen table like something physical, and like smoke from a candle just blown out. Marcus Freed looked at Daniel Escobedo. Dr. Adriana Sousa looked at her hands. Daniel looked at Rosa. And in the quality of that moment, in the particular arrangement of 4 people sitting around a dead man's kitchen table on a clear October morning, with the number $256 million still present in the air between them, Rosa understood something she could not have anticipated feeling. She had expected joy. She had expected the particular, overwhelming relief of a woman who has been holding herself together for 3 years by the force of will alone, and is suddenly given permission to stop holding. She had expected tears, possibly. She had expected her hands to shake. What she felt instead was a strange and absolute clarity, the kind that comes not when a problem is solved, but when a person finally understands what the problem actually was. The problem had never been money. The problem had been the feeling of having been abandoned by the world's sense of justice, the feeling of doing everything correctly and being rewarded with less and less until less threatened to become nothing. What was happening in this kitchen was not the solution to a financial problem. It was the world's sense of justice finally arriving, late and overwhelming, and not at all in the form she would have designed for it, but real, undeniably, permanently real. Marcus Freed answered her question with the practical precision of a man who understood that the most important thing he could offer in this moment was not sentiment, but direction. He told her she needed a lawyer, specifically an estate attorney, who had experience with significant asset recoveries and who understood the particular legal landscape of inherited wealth involving historical artifacts and precious metals. He gave her a name. He told her the firm was in the city and that he would make a call on her behalf if she wanted, which would remove the barrier of cold introduction and ensure she was seen promptly. She said yes. He told her she needed to inform no one of the discovery's specifics until she had legal representation in place. He said this with enough emphasis that she understood it was not a suggestion, and he said the chamber should be secured. He recommended a locksmith who specialized in historic properties and who had the discretion his business demanded, and that no further access to the contents should occur until the legal framework was established. He told her the valuation process would take time, that the provenance research on the documentary materials alone could require months, and that the painting's attribution would involve laboratory analysis that was not a quick process. He told her that the final number, when it was established properly, would be different from the preliminary figure he had placed in front of her. He did not tell her in which direction it would differ, but when she looked at Dr. Sousa, the specialist's expression told her enough. Dr. Sousa said, "The provenance records in those document bundles, so if they are what I believe they may be, will be significant not only for establishing the value of the other items, but in their own right as historical artifacts. There are institutions, museums, universities, cultural foundations that would have considerable interest in those documents, regardless of what they contain." She looked at Rosa steadily. "You should know that what you have found is not only a financial inheritance, it is a historical one." She paused. "Your uncle understood that. I believe that is part of why he protected it the way he did." Rosa thought about this on the drive home. She thought about it in the particular suspended way of people who have received news too large to process in motion, some filing it carefully in a temporary space, while the necessary functions of driving and navigating and stopping at lights continued on their automatic track. She thought about her uncle spending his long, private life as the custodian of this thing, protecting not just objects, but the record of where they came from and what they meant, understanding that the value of something old is never only in its material substance, but in its continuity, in the chain of knowing that connects what was made in the past to the people living in the present who are capable of understanding it. She thought about the small book with the name she did not recognize written inside its cover, and she thought about the phrase that followed it in the different hand. "This is the record. Keep it whole." Her uncle had kept it whole, and now she had inherited both the record and the responsibility. She called the lawyer Marcus Freed had named from the car, using the speaker, and a receptionist told her the attorney could see her on Tuesday. She said Tuesday was fine. She thanked the receptionist. She ended the call and drove the remaining 40 minutes home in silence, letting the road and the engine and the occasional sign be the only language that reached her. When she pulled up in front of the apartment building, it was 5:30 in the afternoon, and the light was going golden in the way of October evenings that have decided to be generous on the way out. She sat in the parked car for a moment. Through the window of Janet's apartment, 2 floors up on the opposite side of the building, she could see the blue flicker of the television and the silhouette of 2 people sitting close together on a couch. She thought about Marisol watching a movie at Janet's, eating 2 helpings of dinner, showing no signs of slowing down. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. Then she pressed it away. Then she got out of the car and went to collect her daughter. She told no one. The days that followed were the strangest of her life, stranger even than the days after Diego left, because those days had had the quality of subtraction, the world becoming less, while these days had the quality of a pressure building behind a wall she could not yet open. She went to the dry cleaners. She pressed shirts. She served tables 4 nights that week and smiled at customers and kept her coffee warm between tables and split her tips into the envelope she kept for Marisol's field trip fee. She studied for her bookkeeping module at the kitchen table with the laptop fan running. She checked in with the lawyer, whose name was Carmen Estrada, on Tuesday and then again on Thursday, and each call moved her one methodical step further through a process that was proceeding with the careful, professional speed of people who understood what was at stake and were not interested in making mistakes. Carmen Estrada was exactly the kind of lawyer Rosa had not been able to afford before this. Precise, unimpressed by the size of what she was handling, and focused entirely on doing it correctly. She told Rosa at their second call that the preliminary legal framework was in place, that the discovery had been properly documented, and that the process of formal appraisal could begin. She told Rosa that the confidentiality protocols were holding. She told Rosa to be patient. Rosa was patient. She had had practice. 3 weeks after the kitchen table conversation, the formal appraisal process began. It involved more experts than Rosa had expected. Specialists in numismatics, in colonial European goldsmithing, in historical document authentication, in art conservation. They came to the house in pairs and small groups on 3 separate Saturdays, and each time Rosa drove north and let them into the bedroom and stood near the doorway while they worked. So she watched them handle the contents of the chamber with the care of people who understood that what they were holding had survived several centuries and deserved to survive several more. She watched them measure and weigh and photograph and consult each other in the shorthand of shared expertise. She watched Dr. Sousa, who was present at each session, move through the documentary materials with the focused intensity of someone reading a language they love, extracting meaning that was not available to anyone without her specific formation. On the 3rd Saturday, Dr. Sousa sat down with Rosa in the kitchen after the others had finished their work, and the chamber was sealed again. She set a folder on the table between them. The documents, she said, were provenance records. They detailed the origins and successive ownership of the chamber's contents across more than 2 centuries, beginning with a family of Catalan merchants in the mid-18th century and tracing through a series of protective transfers across national borders and across generations, each transfer documented with the careful bureaucratic thoroughness of people who understood that what they were passing along was not simply wealth, but a trust. The transfers had happened during periods of historical upheaval, wars, revolutions, political instabilities, and each time the contents had been moved or hidden or both, the documentation had been maintained and included with the objects rather than kept separately, which was why it had survived intact, while so many provenance records from the same period had been lost or destroyed. She said, "Your great-grandfather, or the generation before him, received this in the early 20th century from a family who was unable to continue protecting it themselves." The letter accompanying that transfer, which is in the bundle and has now been translated, makes clear that the intention was for the receiving family to protect the contents until such a time as the political and legal landscape allowed for proper repatriation to a cultural institution, or until the provenance could be established in a way that satisfied the demands of legitimate ownership. She looked at Rosa. "Your family has been protecting this for over 100 years. Your uncle specifically, for at least the last 40. He spent considerable time and resources establishing the provenance chain in a form that would be legally viable." She tapped the folder. "Now, what is in here is sufficient. The provenance is clean. Clean provenance." Rosa said those 2 words back and understood them in the way that people who have spent time in systems that do not work well for them understand the particular relief of 2 words, meaning that the system, in this case, intends to function correctly. The painting's attribution came 6 weeks later. Carmen Estrada called Rosa on a Wednesday afternoon between the dry cleaning shift and the waitressing shift, and Rosa took the call in the parking lot behind the dry cleaners, standing in the pale autumn sun with her phone pressed to her ear and her free hand flat against the brick wall of the building. Carmen said that the laboratory analysis was complete and that the attribution had been confirmed to the highest standard of certainty available. She named the painter. Rosa knew the name. She did not know it the way Dr. Sousa knew it, with the fullness of specialist expertise, but she knew it the way an educated person who has spent her life surrounded by books and has read more than circumstances might have predicted knows names that matter, with recognition and a sense of scale. The painting was a missing work from a major period of the artist's output, the subject of decades of scholarly inquiry and institutional search, last documented in a private collection that had been dispersed during the Second World War and whose contents had been only partially traced in the 80 years since. Carmen told her the confirmed value of the painting. She said it as a number, clearly and without decoration. Rosa looked at the brick wall in front of her and breathed. So the number was larger than the preliminary estimate Marcus Freed had placed on the table in the kitchen 6 weeks ago. It was larger by a margin that required Rosa to do arithmetic she had not expected to need. She called no one. She ended the call with Carmen and stood in the parking lot for 4 minutes and looked at the sky, which was the particular blue of a Wednesday afternoon in November that has decided to be clear. Then she went inside and finished her shift and pressed the remaining shirts with the same attention she had brought to every shirt for 3 years, because the shirts still needed pressing, and the people waiting for them still needed them pressed correctly. And Rosa Delgado had never done her work carelessly, regardless of what was happening in the other rooms of her life. The final valuation, issued by Carmen Estrada's firm in coordination with the appraisal specialists, 4 months after the day Rosa first traced the seam with her fingertip, came to $312 million. The chamber's gold content, coins and bars, assessed individually by weight and rarity and historical significance, contributed $64 million. The documentary materials, sold to a consortium of cultural institutions that had competed for the right to acquire and preserve them, contributed $22 million. The remaining items, the fitted cases from the upper shelves which had contained jeweled objects, whose craft and materials put them in a category of their own, contributed $11 million. And the painting, I transferred to a major museum through a negotiated agreement that gave Rosa 90% of the appraised value in exchange for full public access and attribution, contributed $215 million. $312 million. The number sat on the formal document that Carmen Estrada placed before her in a conference room with a view of the city on a Thursday morning in February, and Rosa looked at it with the steadiness she had spent 3 years building. She was wearing the same jacket she had worn the first day she walked into the house on Calle Miramar, the same boots with the thin soles. She had not bought new clothes. She had not told anyone. So she had continued to press shirts and serve tables and study bookkeeping and fold the cot each morning so that Marisol would not have to see it as a permanent feature of their life. She had continued to do all of these things because she understood, in the same clear and absolute way she had understood in the kitchen on that October morning, that what was happening was not a rescue from the life she had been living. It was a return of something that had always been hers in some essential sense. The life she was living was the same life. What was changing was the room in which it had enough space to exist properly. She signed the documents Carmen placed before her. She signed them one at a time, reading each page fully before adding her name, on the way her uncle had taught her to read, with patience and the understanding that some things reveal themselves only when you have earned the ability to see them. When she had signed the last page, Carmen extended her hand and shook Rosa's and said, with the warmth she had been professional enough to contain throughout the entire process, that it had been an honor. Rosa thanked her and meant it. She drove to Janet's apartment that afternoon. It was a Thursday, one of the evenings she did not waitress, and she had texted Janet that morning to say she was coming and to ask if she would be home. Janet had texted back a single affirmative and a question mark, because Rosa did not often come by on a Thursday without a reason involving Marisol. Rosa had not explained. She had said, "See you at 3." She sat in Janet's kitchen, a kitchen of the same approximate size and layout as her own, with the same water pressure problems and the same insufficient light. And she told Janet everything. She told it from the beginning, from the phone call at the dry cleaners, to the eucalyptus trees, to the envelope in the third drawer, to the seam that was not a seam, to the panel that swung open to the chamber, to the coins and the bars, and the wrapped painting, and the kitchen table with the preliminary number, and the Wednesday afternoon in the parking lot, and the conference room that morning, and the number on the document she had signed. She told it all the way through without stopping, and Janet listened without interrupting, which was one of Janet's particular gifts. This ability to create a space large enough for another person's full story. When Rosa finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Janet said, "Oh, honey." She said it the way a person says something when what they actually mean requires a language that does not exist yet. Then Janet started to cry, which surprised Rosa, who had not cried yet herself. And seeing Janet cry made something in Rosa's chest give way with a slowness that was almost structural, like a wall that has been holding back a great deal of water, finally making the decision to stop trying. They sat at Janet's kitchen table, and Rosa cried for approximately 6 minutes, which was the first time she had cried since the morning she had sat in a lawyer's parking lot 3 years ago and given herself 11 minutes before trusting herself to drive. The crying was not grief, and it was not joy exactly. It was the physical expression of 3 years of pressure being released all at once, the body's honest accounting of what it costs to carry a heavy thing for a long time without putting it down. She handed Janet an envelope when she left. Inside was a check for $40,000. She said, "This is not repayment." She said, "This is me wanting to be the kind of person who can do this." Janet tried to give it back, and Rosa would not take it back, and they stood in the doorway of Janet's apartment with the envelope between them until Janet finally folded it against her chest and said, "Thank you," in the voice of someone who understands that refusing a gift is sometimes its own kind of unkindness. She paid off the car. She paid the remaining balance on the promissory note against the house on Calle Miramar. She called the bookkeeping school and paid for the remaining modules of her certificate in full because she intended to finish what she had started, and the reason for starting it had not diminished simply because she no longer needed the income it would bring. She set aside a fund for Marisol's education that would carry her from elementary school through any advanced degree she chose to pursue, without ever requiring Marisol to calculate the cost against a limited account. She gave to several organizations, a food security nonprofit in their city, a children's scholarship foundation, a cultural preservation fund that supported the digitization of historical documents in the region her family's ancestors had come from. She gave without announcement and without expectation of acknowledgement. She gave the way her uncle had given, all quietly and with the understanding that the gesture's value was in the act rather than the recognition. She gave her notice at the dry cleaners. She gave it with genuine gratitude to the owner, a man named Mr. Park, who had been fair to her and who had never once made her feel that her position there was anything less than essential. She told him she needed to attend to a family property. He shook her hand. She worked her last 2 weeks with the same attention she had brought to every shift before them. She did not give notice at the diner immediately. She worked her regular shifts for 3 additional weeks before telling them, because she wanted the decision to feel like a choice rather than a consequence, and because she liked the other servers and the cook, who always left her an extra portion when the kitchen had remaining food at the end of a slow night, and who had never known her last name and would not know now why she was leaving, only that she was. On her last night, she left the full amount of her tips for the shift on the table for the busser, and walked out into the cold night air and looked at the lit street and the late cars and the particular nighttime texture of a city that continues its business long after most of its people have gone to bed. And she felt enormous love for it, for the indifferent, luminous, complicated city that had contained her difficult years and was now preparing to contain something different. She told Marisol on a Saturday morning in March, on sitting at their kitchen table with the coffee she had made and the orange juice she had poured, and the particular quality of weekend morning light that always seemed slower and more generous than weekday light. She told it simply. She said, "Your great uncle left us something," she said. "We are going to be all right." She said, "You can have strawberries whenever you want." Marisol, who was 9 now, and possessed of a 9-year-old's complete and immediate focus on the concrete implications of any piece of information, said, "Every day?" Rosa said, "Every day." Marisol considered this for a moment with the seriousness the question deserved. Then she said, "Can we also plant some?" Rosa said, "Yes." She said, "We're going to have a garden." Such she said, "We are going to live in Uncle Aurelio's house, and it has a yard with old stone borders where flower beds used to be." Marisol set down her orange juice with the careful deliberateness of a person absorbing something significant. Then she said, "Will there be room for tomatoes?" And Rosa said, "Yes, there will absolutely be room for tomatoes." And Marisol reached across the table and took Rosa's hand, with both of her small ones, and held it, and didn't say anything else, which was more than enough. They moved to the house on Calle Miramar in May, when the eucalyptus trees were throwing their long shadows across the gravel drive in the morning, and the old stone borders in the yard held a particular promise that they had not held in October, when Rosa had first seen them from the kitchen window. Marisol ran through the house on the first day the way children run through new spaces, with the specific joy of a person discovering the dimensions of a world that is entirely theirs. She ran up the stairs and down the hall and into the bedroom at the end, where the wardrobe stood, and she pressed her palm against the dark wood and looked up at the carved panels with the same steady gaze she brought to the spiderweb on the apartment fire escape, the gaze of a child who has not yet been told what to find remarkable, and therefore finds everything remarkable, which is the closest thing to wisdom available to a 9-year-old. Rosa stood in the doorway and watched her. The wardrobe stood in its place, its doors closed, its secrets now properly transferred to the institutions and legal frameworks that would hold them going forward. The chamber behind the back panel was empty and clean, its shelves bare, its climate system still quietly running in the engineered dark. She had thought about what to do with the chamber once it was emptied, and had decided to leave it as it was. The house deserved to keep its architecture intact. Some structures are worth preserving, not for what they hold, but for what they demonstrate about the human capacity to protect what matters. The bedroom would be Marisol's room. This had been Rosa's decision, made on the day she measured the windows for curtains and stood in the room for a moment, thinking about her uncle sleeping in here for all his long, careful years, and thinking that a child's laughter in this space would be the right next thing for it to hold. Marisol had chosen yellow curtains. She had chosen them at the fabric store with the total conviction of a person who has been asked what she wants and has found, for the first time, that the question is not theoretical. Rosa's room was across the hall. It had a window that faced east and caught the morning light before the eucalyptus trees blocked it, and she had put her bed under that window, so that the first thing she saw every morning was the light that was the same light her uncle had seen. Every morning he had lived in this house, the particular quality of northern coastal morning that was different from city morning in the way that things which have not been altered by proximity to large numbers of people are different, quieter in every sense, and more itself. She finished her bookkeeping certificate in July. She sat the final exam at a testing center in the nearest city and passed it with a score that the proctor, who was not given to personal comment, mentioned was notably high. She thanked him. She drove home on the coastal road, which she had discovered was 40 minutes longer than the inland route, but so substantially more beautiful that the extra time was not a cost, but a gift. She made the drive with the windows down and the radio off and the smell of the ocean coming in from the west, and she thought about the version of herself who had been sitting at a kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, trying to load a module on a laptop that kept giving up halfway through, studying for a credential that would have added perhaps $12 an hour to her earning capacity. She thought about that version of herself with tenderness and without condescension, because that version of herself had been doing the best available thing with the available materials, which is the only thing any person can do, and which deserves respect rather than pity. The people who had been in her life during the difficult years responded to the news of her changed circumstances in the ways that people respond to such things, which is to say, with a wide range of reactions that revealed a great deal about each person. Janet continued to be Janet, warm, matter-of-fact, accepting of the change without either inflating it or deflating it, treating Rosa the same way she had always treated her, which was as a person whose company she valued for its own sake. The co-workers at the dry cleaners who had been kind were kind in exactly the same way after the news spread as they had been before, and Rosa appreciated this more than she could easily articulate. A few people she had known peripherally, acquaintances from the diner, neighbors from the apartment building, responded with the particular combination of warmth and discomfort that accompanies the reversal of an established status relationship. And Rosa was patient with this discomfort without encouraging it. She had no interest in being a symbol. She had been a person throughout the difficult years, and she was a person now, and the continuity of that identity was more important to her than any other single thing the changed circumstances could offer. There was one afternoon, in the first autumn after the move, on when Marisol's school held a parents' evening that Rosa attended in a dress she had bought at a small shop in the town near Calle Miramar. Nothing remarkable. A good dress, well made, in a color that suited her. She arrived and was shown to Marisol's classroom by a teacher who greeted her with the brisk warmth of a professional. She sat in one of the small chairs the children used and listened to the teacher describe Marisol's progress and her particular strengths, her curiosity, her careful attention, her unusual willingness to sit with a question rather than rushing toward an answer. The teacher said she was a remarkable student. Rosa listened to this and felt something that was not pride exactly, or not only pride, but the particular satisfaction of recognizing something you suspected was true confirmed by an independent witness. She had always known that Marisol's way of paying attention was something to hold on to. It was good to hear that a person trained to observe children saw it too. She drove home that evening on the coastal road, the autumn dark coming early, and the headlights pulling the road forward out of the darkness, and she thought about her uncle writing her name on an envelope and putting it in a drawer. She thought about him choosing her specifically, not from sentiment or from the absence of other options, but from the same careful, deliberate evaluation that had characterized everything he did, including the way he had spent 4 decades protecting a chamber full of historical objects from a world that was not always trustworthy with things of great value. He had watched her from whatever distance the years had placed between them, and he had decided that she was the right person. Not because she was lucky or clever or deserving in some abstract moral sense, but because he believed she would know what to do. He had written that down and left it in a kitchen drawer for her to find. Rosa will know what to do. She has always known what to do. She thought about whether that had been true. She thought about the $9,000 she had scraped together without knowing what it was for, about the envelope in the 3rd drawer and the seam she had traced with her fingertip and the patience she had brought to Daniel Escobedo's slow, methodical work in the bedroom. She thought about sitting in the kitchen with Marcus Freed's notebook open on the table and the number $256 million present in the air and saying, now with a steadiness she had practiced for 3 years, "What do I do next?" She thought that what her uncle had recognized in her was not a talent for wealth or for discovery, but a talent for bearing the weight of things and continuing to move. The same talent that had gotten her through 3 years of difficulty. The talent was not specific to hard times. It transferred. She pulled into the gravel drive, and the headlights swept across the eucalyptus trees and the front of the house and the porch, where the old wooden steps creaked in a specific order she had already memorized. The kitchen light was on. Marisol had been with a neighbor's family for the evening and would be home in an hour. Rosa sat in the parked car for a moment, looking at the lit window and the house holding itself together in the dark, the same way it had held itself together for the years before she arrived, patient and full and waiting. She thought about her uncle in this house. She thought about her grandfather receiving the wardrobe from hands that could no longer protect it. She thought about the family in Catalonia in the 18th century, who had built the chamber with the precision of people who understood that some things need to outlast their first owners, who had entrusted their craft and their care to the wood itself and to the chain of people who would follow them. She thought about Marisol upstairs choosing yellow curtains. She thought about tomatoes growing in old stone borders. She got out of the car, and the night air was cold and clean and carried the eucalyptus smell she had come to associate with home in the way that smells attach themselves to the places where important things happen. She walked up the porch steps in their specific creak order and unlocked the front door and went inside. And the house received her the way houses receive the people who belong to them, with the particular and absolute warmth of a thing that has been waiting and is glad to no longer be waiting. She stood in the entry hall for a moment. The shelves of her uncle's books lined the living room. She had kept them all, read through a quarter of them since the move, and intended to read all the rest. On the shelf nearest the door, at eye level, was the novel he had given her when she was 10. She had found it in a box in her own apartment when she packed, and still carrying the inscription on the inside cover in his careful hand. For Rosa, who I believe will understand this someday. She had placed it here deliberately, where she would see it each day when she came in. Not as a monument, as a conversation. The kind you continue with a person you love even after they are no longer in the room with you, because the things they gave you keep speaking in their voice if you pay the kind of attention they taught you to pay. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. Through the window, the yard was dark, but she knew the shapes of the old stone borders by heart now, and she knew that beneath the October-cleared beds, bulbs she had planted with Marisol in September were doing the slow, underground work of becoming something that would be beautiful in the spring. The tomatoes had gone in late in the season and had produced only a small harvest, but Marisol had eaten every one of them standing in the garden, with her shoes getting muddy, declaring each one in succession the best tomato she had ever tasted, which was something Rosa intended to remember for the rest of her life. The kettle came to its quiet boil. She made the tea. She carried it to the table and sat down and looked at the wood grain of the surface in the kitchen light, the old wood, steady and present, and she thought, this is the table where the number was said. This is the table where I understood that the past can give rather than only take. This is the table where I asked, what do I do next? And people who knew what they were looking at helped me find the answer. And she ran her palm across the surface, the way she had run her fingertip along the seam in the wardrobe's interior, slowly and with attention, and with the understanding that surfaces are not the whole story, that behind the things we first see, there is almost always a depth that we did not initially account for, and that the depth is where the truth lives, waiting, patient as old wood, for the person who is willing to look carefully enough to find it. Outside, a car turned into the gravel drive. The headlights swept briefly across the kitchen window. Rosa heard the car door, then the gate at the side yard, then footsteps, and a voice she recognized as the neighbors saying goodnight, and then the particular sound of her daughter's feet on the porch steps, a sound she would know in any context at any distance, the specific rhythm of Marisol's 9-year-old approach. The door opened. The sound of the house accepting her daughter filled the entry hall. Then Marisol appeared in the kitchen doorway, shoes off already, hair loose from its braid, and she looked at her mother sitting at the table with the tea, and she said, "Are you sad?" because that was the kind of child she was, the kind who looked at a person's face and asked the real question. Rosa said, "No," she said, "come and sit with me." And Marisol padded across the kitchen floor in her socks and pulled out the chair beside her mother's and sat in it and leaned her head against Rosa's shoulder with the easy, complete trust of a child who has never doubted that the shoulder will be there. And they sat together at the table in the kitchen of the house on Calle Miramar, and Rosa held her daughter's hand with both of hers and looked at the window where the yard was dark and the garden was sleeping, and the spring was somewhere ahead, doing its patient, invisible work. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not look like bravery from the outside. It looks like a woman pressing shirts, like a woman splitting tips into an envelope, like a woman sitting at a kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, studying for a credential she may never need. Like a woman saying yes to a $9,000 obligation she does not know how to meet, because something in her understands, without the language to explain it, that the right things are worth the impossible costs. It looks like 3 years of doing the next necessary thing, and the next one, and the next one after that, without the guarantee of any particular outcome, sustained only by the rope of a child's breathing and a stubborn refusal to accept that less is all there is. Rosa Delgado had that courage before the wardrobe opened. The wardrobe opening did not give it to her. It recognized what was already there. It returned to her what the world owed her, the space and the capacity and the material conditions in which that courage could become what it had always been trying to become. Not just survival, but a life, full and particular, and hers. The eucalyptus trees stood in the dark outside the window. The house breathed its old breath around them, and Rosa held her daughter's hand and let the future arrive in its own time, patient as a seam in old wood, patient as a chamber sealed and waiting, patient as a letter placed in a drawer by someone who loved her and knew she would find her way. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.